The White Lady hoax. Just so we all have the same context going into this, the White Lady is the name of the ghost that haunts the Union Cemetery in Easton, Connecticut. Most locals believe her to be the ghost of Harriet Seeley, whose young son passed shortly after being born, with Harriet herself passing soon after. Legend believes she may have died in hopes of finding her son and still wanders their final resting place searching him out. Other folks believe the White Lady is the ghost of a woman from the 1940s who killed her husband and later, herself, and is doomed to wander the graveyard. Her physical description is the one thing that remains consistent. She is a young woman wearing a white dress with dark hair. It seems as if she enjoys scaring the daylights out of the living, so my kind of girly. Many who have witnessed her believe they have almost hit her with their vehicle, only to find no trace of her once they pull over. Others claim they have often seen her hovering slightly above the ground around the cemetery, going back and forth amongst different gravestones. Now, Ed Warren was obsessed with her and has gone on record, as being determined to capture footage of her on film. And once he was able to do so, he kept the tape for himself. Yeah, he hoarded that tape like it held the secrets to the universe, or like he was the US government with all the proof they have of alien life. He allowed a very select few people to view it while it was being held in his personal archives, and none were allowed to further analyze it on their own time. Now, since the passing of both Ed and Lorraine, their son-in-law Tony has released the footage in its entirety to YouTube. The tape shows an apparent white human figure moving behind some tombstones. Similar to videos of UFOs, Bigfoot, and the Loch Ness Monster, however, the figure is at that perfect distance and resolution so that a shape can be seen, but no details that could lead to definitive identification. A woman named Judith Penny, who claimed she helped Ed maintain his reputation as a ghost hunter, comes into play right here. So when he claimed to have captured the White Lady on tape in the summer of 1990, after allegedly camping out in the graveyard for a week, it was actually Judith being the mystical being spotted on tape, masking herself with a white sheet. So scary. About as scary as a poorly made Halloween costume. Number 4, the Snedeker case. Okay, so for the unaware, let's just run through the case as if it was real at first, just for funsies. One night, very late at night, Ed and Lauren were contacted by the family, who had just moved into a house on Meriden Avenue in Southington. Specifically, the mother of the family unit and a niece who came to stay with the family were on the phone. What they found and bought was a big and seemingly welcoming home. But what they allegedly didn't know was that it was a former funeral home. Oh, and fun fact, the morticians at the funeral home were allegedly involved in necrophilia, or performing acts with corpses. What used to be the showroom for the coffins was now the younglings room, just down the hall. Oh, and just down the hall, the place where bodies were prepared for viewing. So the boys were the first to start talking about things they had seen and experienced, saying they were terrified, and the parents chastised them at first for it, but they were so scared that they started sleeping on the floor in the living room. Among the sounds the boys would hear were the sounds of chains pulling the coffins upstairs. Only thing was, there was no coffins. So the women who called were terrified, with the niece in a small bedroom in the back of the house, and the covers on her bed tended to levitate around her, like there was a fan blowing them around. Lorraine said that while the mother was on the phone with her, even more bizarre events started happening. So the mother had rosary beads in her hand, and while she spoke, the beads were actually being pulled apart and falling to the floor. So Lorraine and Ed went over the next morning with the family's parish priest. A blessing of the house seemed to do nothing to calm things down, and that's when the Warrens decided to call the bishop's office in Hartford. The church eventually sent an exorcist, which seemed to do the trick, but not before one last hurrah from whatever was believed to be haunting the house, because demons don't like to give up without a fight. So there was this huge tree in front of the house, and half of the tree, with no wind, broke off and fell on the property. So when it came time to publish the story of what happened, who did Ed and Lorraine bring in to help them write the book? Ray Garton, an author well known for writing fictional horror. In the years since, he has very publicly claimed that everything to do with the case was bunk. When Ray found that the family couldn't keep their individual stories straight, he went to Ed, and the man of the hour simply just said, all the people who come to him and Lorraine are crazy. That's why they come to them. Just use what you can to make the rest up. You write scary books, right? Well, make it up and make it scary. That's why we hired you. If that wasn't damning enough right there, apparently the boys, the center of this entire mess, were nowhere to be found. Ray never met them in person and was only allowed to talk to them briefly on the phone, but as soon as one of the boys started telling Ray that the things he saw in the house went away after he'd been medicated, the mom abruptly ended the conversation. The Warrens repeatedly told Ray they had videotapes of actual supernatural activity shot in the house, and they were going to show it to him while he was there, but they never did. Ray never saw the inside of the house because the people living there at the time wanted absolutely nothing to do with this circus and claimed there were no problems at all in the house. The Warrens explained that this was because the house had been cleansed, by a priest who had performed an exorcism, but to the best of Ray's knowledge, the Catholic Church had absolutely nothing to do with the Warrens in any official way, and there are actually questions about the legitimacy of the priests who worked with them. So remember how the family claimed they had no idea the house was a formal funeral home until they, Moved in. Turns out nearly everyone in that neighborhood knew it was a former funeral home. It was no secret. The supernatural problems in the house didn't start until the landlord, frustrated after months of being unable to get rent out of the family, made moves to have them evicted, and then all of a sudden the house was infested with demons. What a coincidence. Apparently there have been no problems in that house since.
Next up at number 3, The Devil Made Me Do It. And it's pretty hard to deny evidence that has passed through the judicial system. If you're familiar with the Devil Made Me Do It case, you'll know it involves a man named Arne Cheyenne Johnson, who was inadvertently possessed by the same demon that afflicted his 11-year-old stepson, David. Arne was arrested and tried for murdering his landlord, Alan Bono, and in his legal defense claimed that the devil had made him do it. Of course, it didn't work, and he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years for first-degree manslaughter. Now, the Warrens were heavily involved in this case, claiming to have performed 3 exorcisms on the young David Glatzel, while a number of priests involved in the case denied any of which had ever taken place. However, years later in 2007, Carl Glatzel, David's older brother, sued the Warrens for unspecified damages, claiming that his family were manipulated by the demonologists for monetary gain. He claimed that they concocted a phony story in an attempt to get rich and boost their paranormal fame, exploiting young David's mental illness in the process. In his own tell-all book, Alone Through the Valley, which personally is a bit of a double standard, he outlined the fact that none of the Warrens' claims had ever actually happened, and that the book was a complete fabrication of the events that had actually transpired. Swinging in at number 2, the Enfield poltergeist. And this one, I will admit, is open to your own interpretation. It's interesting then that perhaps one of the most famous cases that the Warrens were associated with the Enfield poltergeist was the case that they were most minimally involved with. It forms the basis of James Wan's 2016 film The Conjuring 2, where the fictional versions of the Warrens pretty much single-handedly deal with the events that transpired in the August of 1977 in Enfield, a suburb of London. The story itself was a media sensation, where 11-year-old Janet and her 13-year-old sister Peggy were afflicted by the presence of a malevolent poltergeist. Although the evidence has been notoriously scrutinised, Ed and Lorraine Warren maintain that their flying visit to London featured some of the most startling paranormal events that they'd ever seen. One of which was when Ed swore blind, a claim that he made in his book The Demonologist, that he saw Janet sound asleep levitating in midair. It's interesting then that in all the photographic evidence provided by the Warrens, both girls are wide awake and appear to be falling, definitely not levitating. Perhaps the most damning admission though is a statement that Janet made in 2011 at the age of 45, that she and her sister had faked most of the phenomena. The thing is though, it didn't matter to the Warrens. Their involvement with the case propelled them to a legendary status, even though much of that involvement was superficial at best. It's an interesting one, and we'll likely never know the full extent of the Enfield poltergeist. One thing is for certain though, Ed Warren made up nearly all of his involvement.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Smurl family haunting. Back in the 1980s, the Smurl family swore that their house was haunted. They would hear loud noises, smell foul odors, and hear pig grunts. Apparently, whatever was haunting their house also threw their dog to the wall and pushed one of their daughters down the stairs. Of course, Ed and Lorraine Warren came to investigate, and they claimed that this place was haunted. They even said that they saw a message appear on a mirror that read, "Get out." But get this, members of the clergy were brought in to do a blessing and an exorcism on the house. And guess what? They reported nothing unusual happened there. In fact, one of the priests had this to say about the Warrens, and I quote, "They weren't sincere, were not what they purported to be, and were given to sensationalizing." In the end, the church said that the family was just stressed over the health of their son who had brain surgery, and the foul odor that they smelt was because of a cracked sewer pipe right by their home. But the Warrens were adamant that the house was haunted, and then they turned the story into a book and made some money, so just saying.
Number 3, The Haunting in Connecticut. The Haunting in Connecticut, although not officially part of the greater Conjuring cinematic universe and its several sequels, is nonetheless a very famous American haunting, detailing a poltergeist and, well, take a wild guess where. The story goes that the Snedeker family purchased a home near a hospital where their son was receiving treatment without knowing the home was formerly a funeral home, and were then exposed to all sorts of hauntings, strange sounds, possessions, the usual gamut of spooky stuff. The story was adapted into a film, The Haunting in Connecticut, which Lorraine Warren took great umbrage with, claiming that it was sensationalizing the real story and making it out to be something it's not. Which is very ironic. The Warrens themselves helped pen a book about the haunting called In a Dark Place, Exorcisms. The book was written by the Warrens and co-authored by Ray Garton, a horror novelist who was brought in to help shape the story. However, after the experience, Garton spoke out about writing the book, saying that when he interviewed the family, multiple stories just wouldn't add up and they would all provide different accounts of what was happening. He brought this concern to Ed Warren, and Ed Warren told him, as Garton quotes, "Oh, they're crazy. You've got some of the story. Just use the parts that work and make the rest up. Just make the rest up and make it seem scary." Which is about as blatantly direct a confession as you could probably get from the Warrens. Since the passing of both Warrens, more and more support has come out, suggesting the haunting of Connecticut was little more than a hoax to drum up some business.
5. Union Cemetery. In Weston, Connecticut, there is a cemetery that many paranormal investigators and enthusiasts claim is one of the most haunted locations in the entire state. As legend goes, many years ago, a man was driving down the road when a woman suddenly appeared in the middle of the road. The driver didn't have time to stop or slow down and struck the woman, but when he pulled over to try and help the woman, she was nowhere to be seen. Since then, several people have reported seeing the woman in white wandering around the cemetery grounds. Some believe she is a woman who lost her son and is still searching for him, while others believe she may have been a jilted bride who took her own life. Either way, it is a local legend that draws a lot of visitors to the town. Oddly enough, this cemetery is just down the road from the home of Ed and Lorraine Warren, and they claimed to have spent a large amount of time trying to find evidence of the White Lady. In 1990, Ed claimed that while he was staying overnight in the cemetery, he saw the bride. As he described it, "I heard a woman weeping, and I looked out and saw hundreds of ghost lights floating around and forming into the figure of a woman. I couldn't make out facial features." He claimed that he did manage to capture this encounter on video, however. This is of course very exciting, as definitive proof of paranormal activity is rare and could completely change the way people view their own mortality. When asked to show the footage that would validate his claims, Ed said, "No. This is the incident that is least clearly a lie out of all of them on this list, but it is typical behavior from the Warrens, who claimed that they had proof that they then simply refused to show to anyone all the way up until their deaths." Oddly enough, the ghosts of the Warrens sometimes pass through the dark dimension and visit me. I even have a recording of it on my phone that proves I'm telling the truth. You can't see it though. You'll just have to take my word for it.
In our second spot, we have the Snedeker family haunting. This is the family haunting that the Haunting in Connecticut movie and book was based off of. Story goes that Alan and Carmen Snedeker moved into a home with their daughter and 3 sons. While exploring their home, they found weird stuff in their basement, like tools morticians would use. That's when they found out that their home used to be a funeral home. And that's when the haunting started. Their eldest son started getting terrifying visions and started seeing ghosts. And also apparently one day as Carmen was mopping the kitchen floor, the water just turned into blood and then smelled of decaying flesh. So on and so on, you get it. In 1986, the Warrens investigated the home and claimed it was indeed infested with demons. But here's the thing. A man named Ray Garton was hired by the Warrens to write a book about the haunting. Later, he revealed that the Snedeker family apparently had serious problems with drugs and alcoholism. When he interviewed the family, they couldn't keep their story straight. And they all had different accounts for what happened. So he went to Ed and told him this problem, and Ed said, and I quote, "You've got some of the story. Just use what works and make the rest up. Just make it up and make it scary." So the writer literally made up like 90% of the story on his own. On top of that, the neighbor living in the upstairs apartment in this haunted home claimed nothing paranormal ever happened to them. And on top of that, no one who has lived in this home after the Snedeker family has had any paranormal experiences. So it looks like the haunting was just made up by this family, and then the Warrens went along with it for the money and the book deal. And in our number 1 spot, we have The Devil Made Me Do It. This is the case that was featured in the film The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It. It revolves around a man named Orange Cheyenne Johnson, who in 1981 fatally stabbed his landlord Alan Bono to death. But he claimed that he was totally unaware what he was doing and that the devil made him do it. In fact, his case was the first court case where the defense was arguing demonic possession. And of course, Ed and Lorraine Warren were involved in this case. In fact, they might have made up this whole story for him to get away with murder. Let me explain. It's wild. So according to the story, Arne's brother-in-law, David Glatzel, was the first one to be possessed by this demon. He claimed a man with big black eyes and a thin face with animal features was controlling him. In reality, David was never possessed. He was mentally ill and needed professional help. According to David's brother Carl, he claimed that his whole family was manipulated by the Warrens. He claimed that the Warrens promised his family that they would become millionaires if they insisted that David was haunted by demons. In the end, he actually sued the Warrens for trying to exploit his brother's mental illness, and for attempting to get a guilty man to walk. Now, where does Johnson come into play? Well, he claims that he got the demon out of David by telling it to take him instead. And that's how he supposedly became possessed.
Off at number 5, Annabelle. You know the one. She's everywhere. She's terrifying, especially in James Wan's silver screen depiction. But if we're being honest, the actual Annabelle, a Raggedy Ann doll given to a nursing student in the 1970s, isn't so terrifying at all. The biggest issue with any of the Warrens' cases is the lack of information provided by the pair, particularly Ed Warren, who was notorious for withholding information for analysis. After declaring that the doll was actually possessed by a demon named Annabelle Higgins, the Warrens took the doll back to their museum, putting it on display for safety's sake. This is where the Annabelle mythos was fully fleshed out. Before his death, Ed would allegedly warn museum visitors that the last man to mock Annabelle ended up dying in a motorcycle crash. Of course, claims that had no substantial evidence or even names associated to them. Joseph Laycock, a professor of religious studies at Texas State University, makes an interesting observation to the phenomenon. At the same time, a similar story emerged, Robert the Doll. You may know it. And what do these two have in common? Why were demonic dolls suddenly the latest craze in the 1970s? Well, it may have something to do with an episode of The Twilight Zone dubbed Living Doll, which featured a character that intriguingly mirrored the same events of the Warrens' doll. What was their name? Well, Annabelle, of course. Coming in next at number 4, the Snedeker family. And this one is pretty blatant, which may explain Lorraine Warren's very public detest for the cinematic interpretation, A Haunting in Connecticut, which she claimed was historically inaccurate and embarrassing. A fair claim to make if she could provide substantial evidence. If you're familiar with the Snedeker family, then you'll know their story. They moved into a house at a knockout price, conveniently located next to a hospital where their young son was receiving treatment for cancer. Of course, it was too good to be true, and the reason why the house was so cheap was because it was previously a funeral home where the morticians were rumoured to have been caught in acts of necrophilia. Not so good. Of course, this meant that the Snedeker home was riddled with demons. Enter Ed and Lorraine Warren. However, the biggest hole in this case comes from Ed Warren himself. After their investigation took place, a best-selling book was written to detail the events. A ghostwriter was attached to it, a man named Ray Garton, a prestigiously decorated horror novelist who describes A Haunting in Connecticut as the low point in his career. Why? Well, a few years later, Garton told Horrorbound magazine that he'd interviewed all the family members about their experiences, but soon realized that the family were going through some very real problems of a more human kind: drug addiction and severe alcoholism. He found that their accounts of the demonic incidents didn't quite mesh. None of them could keep their story straight. When he approached Ed Warren with his problem, his reply was, "Oh, they're crazy. You've got some of the story, just use what works and make the rest up. Just make it up and make it scary."
Number 3, fraudulent items in their museum. So Ed and Lorraine were investigating numerous cases from the 1950s until they passed, right? And they founded a whole society devoted to the research and investigation of the paranormal in 1952, not to forget their entire museum dedicated to objects from their cases. So explain to me how their website only has 10 public case files and why so much from their museum looks like leftovers from a Spirit Halloween. Doesn't anyone else find it pretty suspicious that we only get details from the really big news cases, while artifacts from other lesser cases are barely a footnote and have no story or witnesses attached? So apparently, in one corner of the Warrens Occult Museum, there's the skin of a tiger that is said to have killed 33 people in India while possessed by a demonic spirit. But when I tried to research this weird tiger, I found no account of any reportings in history about such a case, or any offers from Ed and Lorraine to go into detail about any events leading to how it came into their possession. Seriously, look at some of that stuff. Given what I know about modern day Satanism, that idol looks like a papier-mâché alien mock-up. Heck, most folks who practice Satanism don't actually pray to any sort of idol, or to the devil himself. But sure, for a moment I'll pretend that's real, and move on to the black magic skull, which just looks like a cheap haunted house prop for a glow-in-the-dark room. Ditto for the chilling masks. Actually, that's a lie. I've seen cosplayers make better masks. I'm not even gonna try to rationalize the skull with horns, or the recreation of the Witch of Monroe. Y'all don't need to see me fuming right now. Okay. One last thing. Apparently the Warrens have a vampire coffin from a modern-day vampire they claim to have met. Anyone want to explain to me how they couldn't get hard evidence from a vampire, but they could get his coffin? That sounds a lot harder, and that's coming from a self-proclaimed expert on vampire lore. Werewolf exorcism. Alongside Catholic bishops and retired police officers, Ed and Lorraine Warren claimed that they exorcised the angry spirit of a werewolf from a man named Bill Ramsey, who, would reportedly turn into a wolfman. Previously, Ramsey had been arrested for accosting officers, which he attributed to a werewolf demon overtaking him. So Lorraine claimed that she saw his case on TV while she and Ed were visiting England, and she felt that, she could help the man. She even stated that she had a video of Ramsey transforming, but she has never released this video to the public. Golly gee, where have I heard that statement before? Kind of curious how Ed and Lorraine always claim to have all these videos of proof, but the only one that's made its way to the public eyes post-mortem hasn't proved anything about any of the cases. The Warrens went so far as to bring Ramsey back to Connecticut so they could perform an exorcism alongside Bishop Robert McKenna, who was reportedly experienced in exorcising spirits. What's most interesting about this case, however, is that it both demonstrates, the Warrens' fraudulent nature and shows how blindly faithful and devoted believers of their work can be. Consider this passage, okay? The Warrens haven't been able to produce any photos or material evidence, but the very presence of the famous demonologist couple, paranormal collector John Zaffis and famous exorcist Bishop, greatly increases the credibility. However, most resources, touting the truthfulness of this case are just blogs that really love to gush about the Warrens. The Warrens eventually detailed the case in their book, Werewolf, A True Story of Demonic Possession, which one review notes that it contained no actual documentation of the case.
The happy Christian family. The Warrens made a point of portraying themselves as a perfect, loving couple who supported each other while using their supposed gifts to help people who were in trouble and spread the message of God. This carries over into the Conjuring films that were inspired by their lives, with both critics and fans consistently bringing up their relationship as a highlight of the films, with it often being called one of the best love stories of the horror genre. But in real life, they were not quite the shining example of God's perfect couple that they would have you believe. Lorraine Warren had a very large role in shaping how her and her late husband were portrayed on film, with some very specific demands written into her contract. Frankly, a little too specific. Her contract with Warner Brothers explicitly states that neither Ed or Lorraine Warren could be depicted engaging in a physical relationship with in the Conjuring series. Furthermore, neither the husband or wife could be depicted as participating in an extramarital relationship. But why these extremely specific demands? Well, in 2017, a woman named Judith Penny came forward, saying that when she was 15 and Ed Warren was in his 30s, Ed began a physical relationship with her and moved her into his and Lorraine's home, with his wife's knowledge. When Judith became pregnant with Ed's baby, Lorraine, the supposed staunch Catholic, was the one who persuaded her to terminate the pregnancy to avoid a scandal that would ruin the Warrens' careers. As if that weren't bad enough, Judith claims that while living with the couple, they would argue constantly, with the fight often getting physically violent, with Ed routinely attacking Lorraine into unconsciousness. Not exactly the perfect couple that they claimed to be.